Hey, IB History Scholars, it's Mr. Newcomb here. Want to focus in this session on topic 11, cause and effects of 20th century wars. So I'm going to break this up into two parts here. First part is going to be on the world wars, and the second part is going to be on civil wars. So taking a look at world wars, the first one is First World War, and look at the origins and the causes. A rivalry has developed among the great European powers. And so when we talk about great European powers, we're looking at Great Britain, France, Russia. Of course, they're the old school ones. Then you have the newbie, uh, Germany, an older empire as well, the Ottoman Empire. And of course, I can't forget the Austrian-Hungarian Empire being an old-time empire as well. So we have a rivalry. A lot of it has to do with the expanded colonial possessions and the economic competition for control of trade and markets. The arms race developed and created a sense of militarism here in the 19th century. We saw the increase of national armies. A lot of it has to do because of compulsory military service. Great Britain's the only one that doesn't have it. Sophisticated weapons and technology or tactics is being developed here. It's going to make this next war very industrialized. Naval race between Great Britain and France, and of course, it's all about who has a greater navy, and that whoever can control the seas kind of dictates. And Germany is trying to challenge Great Britain for that right now. Great Britain's going to make just about every navy obsolete when they go and create the dreadnought. And then finally, what makes the wars a little bit more prescribed and also make people a little bit more cavalier in their diplomacy is these war plans. Um, the scheduling of when troops need to go from point A to point B and how to do it. The upheaval and arrest in the Balkan Peninsula in Europe is creating problems here. And to kind of give you a point of reference, we're looking at countries like Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece makes up this particular area. And it's just creating a series of crises. It's a multi-ethnic region, and small little countries are kind of trying to jockey for position here to have a greater role. And one of those countries is Serbia, who's acting very nationalistic here and wants to create a greater Serbia. And that's going to create tension with Austria, and it's going to create tension with the Ottoman Empire. I do want to stop here for a moment. Sometimes they interchangeable say Austria, Austro-Hungarian Empire. They really are the same. And so if I'm creating some confusion, they're really the same countries here. A system of treaties and alliances evolved, making war possibility, allows for aggressive behavior. And so by 1914, we have two sides really created in Europe. We have the Triple Entente, which has Great Britain, France, and Russia, and we have the Triple Alliance that has Germany, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And the final trigger that kind of gets this all going here is going to be the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire here. It led to a crisis here between different countries. A lot of discourse is going on between Great Britain, Russia, Germany, and Russia, and Germany and Austria. And Serbia is brought into the fold here as well. Doesn't seem to find a middle ground. An ultimatum is given to Serbia by the Austrian government, and they reject it. And August of 1914, war on. Now, there's always a debate who started it, and so that naturally leads to historiography. And when we look at historiography, we can think of three schools here. First school is traditional view, or the Orthodox view. And these historians tend to believe that Germany and its allies were responsible for the outbreak of the war. Germany gave the blank check to the Austrians, and the Austrians ran with it and were very aggressive to the Serbs. And so Fritz Fischer would be an example there. The revisionists would give the opposite and say that no, it's really the Allies, Russia and Great Britain, for their behavior. They're responsible for the outbreak of the war, whether it's Great Britain misinterpreting Germans' ambition, or Russia and France because of their alliance, makes them more offensive and more aggressive, would say that is forcing Germany to act the way they are doing. And so Niall Ferguson would be an example of that type of historian. Then you have probably a larger pool of historians known as the post-revisionists, and they're saying, hey, you're all to blame in some way. That we can't just focus on one nation or nations, but everyone has a role in here, and let's take a look at the factors that are contributing it, the conditions that might, or the personalities, all that is playing a role here. And so you got John Keegan fitting there, and John Stossinger as well would be some examples. But now, when we look at wars, we also want to take a look at how does it play out. And the war was largely carried out on two fronts: the Western Front along the French and Belgian border, and then the Eastern Front, which is pretty much along the Russian border. The war began with very quick movements and deployments, and a lot has to do with those game plans, those war plans they came up with, like the Schlieffen Plan. But then it eventually grinded down into trench warfare. The fighting in the Middle East and the Balkans and Africa tend to be a little bit more fluid here. Now, when we look at this war, it does develop into what we call a war of attrition, and this is where the technology, all that stuff comes into play here. Both sides had to wear down the enemy by draining its men and its resources. At sea, the attack on merchant fleets and blockades occurred. The submarines were very effective there. Air warfare, though, was not at the point to play a decisive role like it did in the Second World War. The war led to development of new weapons on new scale here. Artillery was larger and more precise. You had these big guns, many of them located on rail. Air power advanced, but again, not to a point where it could determine outcome. Reconnaissance began to start doing some bombings as well here. Submarine warfare nearly won the war for Germany. So again, it had a significant role in terms of affecting the Allies. Battleships had not proven significant because there really wasn't many battles. You had the Battle of Jutland, which the British, I think, are going to lay claim that they won, but probably more of a stalemate. The tank was a major development, but it was designed to help break the stalemate, but it doesn't really break the stalemate, but still the tank was a major development and definitely will play a role in the next war. Probably a big game changer here is biological weapons, gas warfare. When we also look at the nature of the war here and how it affects the public and governments in general, the war relied on a great deal of public support. In order to do that, they got to get mobilized, and propaganda was going to be the key here. Civilian supported the war in numerous ways. They worked in war industries, they financed, they rationed. It was important that people on the home front are behind the war. Resistance to occupation, though, was limited. It wasn't necessarily promoted by the Allies. Guerrilla warfare and organized resistance was not a major feature in this conflict as it would be in the Second World War. The war resulted in two revolutions in Russia and an attempted revolution in both Hungary and Germany. Still, though, when the war was coming to a conclusion, the war in itself became a vehicle for a need for political change. So when we look at the effects and results of the First World War, tremendous human costs here. You can look at the First World War as a killing field. Anywhere from 20 to 30 million people are killed here, vast majority of them being soldiers. And as a result of that, societies become a little stagnant because a good chunk of those who are being killed, they're very young and they're very talented. Considerable impacts on the political boundaries of Europe. Some new countries are going to be created. The redrawing of of Europe happens here. Old empires collapse. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire gone. German Empire is gone. The Russian Empire is gone. The Ottoman Empire is gone. France grows a little bit. Italy grows a little bit here. Great Britain as well. But we have new countries being created here. The emergence of extreme right-wing governments like in Italy, and then left-wing regimes in the Soviet Union happened here. War brought some major social and economic changes here. Attitudes towards women in some countries like the United States, women are going to get the right to vote and some social freedoms. World trade, though, would be disrupted. It's going to take some time to get that reestablished because of the war. The war was a significant turning point in world history here. And then something new that emerges out of it is called the League of Nations. The design was to create a new world order, a society of friends, to try to find a way for collective security. The League of Nations is definitely going to be challenged in the next conflict. And that next conflict is going to be the Second World War. And when we look at the origin of the Second World War, we are going to have to take a look at what comes out of World War I. The term Second World War encompasses a number of linked conflicts in Europe and Asia. And similar to many of the causes of the First World War, you can say that happened in the Second World War. You got the rise of militarism, rearmament, and the military was viewed as a means to solve problems, like in Germany and Japan. There was a growth of this ultra-nationalist ideology. Again, you can see that in fascist Germany and Italy and the more militarized Japan. The war was categorized by a series of attacks by Japan, Germany, and Italy to gain territory, they claimed, for ideological and economic reasons. So going to Manchuria or going into the Sudetenland or going into Abyssinia, Ethiopia, were viewed for those particular reasons. Resistance by world leaders was weak. Collective security failed. The League of Nations dropped the ball on this one here. Appeasement won the day here. Just give in to them and hope that that's all they want. The memory of the First World War just weighed heavily on them. And domestic matters seem to be more important here. After all, the Great Depression is going on. So when we look at the nature of the Second World War, this war would use every resource available. And so we're talking total war. And again, you can make a claim that the First World War was also a total war based on the amount of resources used, every aspect of the state, every aspect of the military, the technology, all that stuff is being used here towards this war, and that's why we call it a total war. This war was between peoples and against peoples. This between soldier and civilian, all that stuff was being blurred at this time here. So in the Second World War, when we look at the amount of casualties, and there's a significant amount of casualties, over 55 million individuals are going to be killed. 2/3 of it is civilians. So there's a lot of blurring of the lines here. Atrocities are going to be committed by the Allies and the Axis powers altogether. Civilians, again, were the targets. Germany engaged in the final solution, primarily getting rid of people that they called Untermensch, which included the Jews. The Allies bombed cities like Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo, that had created firestorms and thousands of casualties that way. And the U.S. engaged in internment camps, interned over 100,000 Japanese aliens and American citizens into internment camps. The weaponry grew more destructive, application of the force. You can see that air power was very, very critical. Development of radar, transporting troops and supplies, long-range bombings definitely had an impact on the outcome, especially when dropping the 2 atomic weapons. Naval ships were more engaging. Aircraft carriers were critical here. The use of sonar, in some ways, helped in the neutralizing the importance of submarines. Tanks continued to evolve. They got faster. They got more powerful. Epic tank battles occurred, whether it was at El Alamein or Kursk, Tobruk. All those tanks are going to play a big role here. Allied and Axis tactics and strategies transformed as the war progressed. And so as a result of that, you definitely saw the killing nature of the war play out. Also, again, it's important that the governments get involved in it as well, and the state of power of participating countries exerted control over all aspects of life here. Government coordination. All the governments who are the major belligerents were coordinating. Civilian participation on the home front was critical. Allied powers recruited women and minorities to work in the factories. Axis powers were reluctant to use women. Instead, they used slave labor. And so up to about 1942-43, they are able to compete with the Allies because of that use of slave labor. But when resources become cut off or restricted, their ability to fight a total war and have war readiness is restricted. Propaganda, of course, is going to be very important. Get everyone on the same page. The propaganda machineries of the United States, Germany, France, Russia, Great Britain, all of them are, Japan, are all going to get heavily involved here. Fight for national survival mentality took over. So when we look at the effects of this war, it is also far-reaching, like the First World War. The human costs of the war were much higher than the First World War. Acts of genocide. There was an act of genocide in the First World War, Turkey trying to get rid of the Armenians. The world quickly forgot about that one, and then the second big genocide of the 20th century occurs with the Jews primarily. 2/3 of the victims I had mentioned earlier were civilians. There was not any real creation of new states, but instead a considerable amount of population movement, and primarily Germans moving. Frontiers were altered. Poland's borders shifted. It moved west. And so Russia, or the Soviet Union, had picked up the eastern part of Poland, and as a result, Poland's going to pick up an eastern part of Germany. Germany and Japan are going to be occupied. Germany occupied by the four Allied powers, where Japan is occupied by the United States. And much of Eastern Europe is absorbed by the Soviet Union. Now, when we look at Paper 2 exams, many of the questions are compare and contrast. And so this particular topic, you will tend to see compare and contrast can be of the causes, can be the use of technology, can be looking at the political outcomes of the world wars. But in either case, I think through this session, I've pointed out many commonalities and differences between the two, so you should be able to handle any of those particular questions.